the name of Jesus can bring people together across so many boundaries, across so many tribes and religions. And it's at Jesus' name that I come and I greet you this morning. I first want to give honor to Your Excellency, and it has really been a joy to be here, to be with President Ruto, as well as the First Lady. And I also want to give honor to all of the other leaders that are here all throughout Kenya. Now, I must confess to you this morning, normally I am not very nervous. But this morning, you know, I was struggling with some issues, even as I prepared for this morning. And they were some personal issues. As I was preparing the story of Nehemiah, I could not help but to remind myself that I am coming home to a place of my ancestors. And I could not help but to begin to process the journey of going to America and now coming home to Africans. And so therefore, I do want you to understand that my primary motivation is not to speak here this morning. It's not. It is not to go on a tour of Kenya. It's not. It is not to go and see some of the wonderful safaris that you have in this wonderful country. My primary reason for being here this morning is that I'm coming back home. And even as my brother Earl and I traveled together, we made that very clear, that we're coming home to see our brothers and our sisters, that we're coming home to walk on lands that our ancestors walked on. We're coming home to swim in streams and lakes that our ancestors swam in, that it is a joy to be here this morning. Thank you for inviting me to come back home. Now, I don't want to take a lot of time, because most of the time when you get someone who's been a preacher for a while, they talk for a long time. Did you notice the secretary this morning? He just kept talking, because preachers talk for a long time, don't we? But I want to make sure that my comments are brief. But I also want to make sure that this wonderful theme that you have, that I give it due justice. And I also want to make sure that the verse that you all presented for the theme this year, I give it due justice. Now, remember, your theme is Arise and Rebuild. Now, I thought that was one of the most radical themes that I've heard in a long time. Because even the word arise means that someone has been sleeping, and therefore it is calling for the continent of Africa to wake up. To wake up, Africa, and reach the potential in which God has given to you. Now, the word arise is very different than the word rebuild, because the word rebuild means that you've got to go to work. And so you don't just rise up. It is time for Kenya to say, God, how in the world do I go to work? How do we go to work? Now, here is the big question that I had even as I prepared to come this morning. What is it that we're going to rebuild? What is it? Is it to build a wall as listed in the passage of Nehemiah? Is it to build other buildings? What is it? What are we together going to build? And what I want to suggest to you this morning, I want to suggest that what the passage is suggesting is that we also rebuild relationships. Because even as we come this morning, and even as we read the text, we see that relationships are an integral part of this text. Now, let me give you an example. If you read in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, you will see 14 pronouns in this text. And as you know, pronouns, they're always talking about people. And so the question that I was asking was, which is easier, to build a wall or to rebuild a relationship? Because rebuilding a wall, you use bricks and mortar and concrete. But to even say that we're going to rebuild a relationship, It is saying, how do we rebuild trust? That's what your Gen Z is asking. How do we rebuild respect? How do we rebuild love? And so this morning as a theme, what I want to just suggest, I want to give you just some principles on how to rebuild and on what to rebuild. Is that all right? So let's take a quick look at it. The first thing, even as we look at this text, and let me read the text for you just briefly. We just heard it. It says, then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruin, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me, and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. And so as I looked at that, what is it that we're trying to rebuild in relationships? You know, I love the great work of the African Union, doing great work. But I'd like to suggest to you this morning, just as an African American coming to Kenya, I think that the first relationship that we must rebuild is a relationship back to your brothers and sisters in the African diaspora. That we in Africa, there in America, we have so many African Americans. We have so many Africans who grew up and their parents grew up in Africa and they sent their children to America. But they decided to stay in America. Some of the greatest minds are in the diaspora. And if you really, really read the text, Nehemiah was not from Jerusalem. Nehemiah was from the diaspora. Just think about it. Nehemiah, he wasn't born in Jerusalem. He was a product of Babylon slavery oppression, where they shipped him from Jerusalem to Babylon, and his mother was raised in Babylon and his grandmother was raised in Babylon. He had been shipped into slavery, and he had been in slavery for years, and all of a sudden he decided, after being in a far country, that it was time to come home. It was time for him to come and use his gifts and talents at home. And I remember last week I had the wonderful privilege of meeting with the ambassador of Kenya in the United States. And as we stood there, he asked me, he challenged me, he said, how in the world, Rickey, do I get in with the Congressional Black Caucus so that I can use the influence that they have back at home? And even then we started processing. How in the world do we use these brothers who are in the diaspora? And how do we use the influence that they have and bring them back home, back to the land in which we came from? How do we be just like this wonderful man Nehemiah and begin to use those relationships? You see, the reality is the relationships in the diaspora helped fund the project in Jerusalem. And I want to say this to you this morning, that you've got brothers and sisters all over the world that God can use in a mighty way to partner with our brothers and sisters in Kenya to say, how can we work together and how can we be together? I think another relationship that we must begin to make sure that we process. I think that your relationship with one another. If you read this wonderful passage, you see that within all these pronouns, they are trying to build this relationship with one another. And one of the tragedies could always be that you have relationships to the diaspora, but you don't have relationships here at home. And you know there are tensions in relationships. I know Your Excellency knows about tensions in relationships. But here's the thing about relationships. All of us say that we follow Jesus. But some of us can be pretty disrespectful and pretty mean. All of us say, we can read the verse in John 13 where Jesus says that they will know that you're my disciple by your love for one another. But when we get angry with one another, we don't love each other very well. And so I remember in Washington, D.C., I was walking down in the lower level of the Capitol. And I had a Republican brother. He was a white brother. And he was a Republican. And I remember when I saw my Republican brother, we greeted each other with a hug. And we talked for about 10 minutes. And as we carried on a conversation with my Republican brother, I looked to the side and I saw a brother from the opposite party coming, an African-American Democrat. So I told my brother, Lee, why don't you stay here with my Republican brother while I go over and while I have a conversation with my Democrat brother. When I left, I could tell the pressure he felt. So when I returned from the conversation and I started to talk to my Republican brother, he asked me, was I one of them? And I asked him, well, what is one of them? What does that mean? He said, I'm asking you, Rickey, are you one of us or are you one of them? And I said, no, I must apologize to you. I'm not one of them. I'm one of his. That my politics never drives my faith. My faith must always drive my politics. That I don't come here to find enemies, because Jesus teaches us this wonderful principle. And here's the principle that I taught him. I said, just think about this brother that you called him. This brother is a pastor. And you say that you follow Jesus. That relationship should make you brothers. And I said, you know what the scripture says that your relationship should be? Jesus says that the people will know that you're my disciples by your love for one another. But yet you're calling him. You've devalued him. I said, but even keeping up with your train of thought, let's say if you devalued him in the scriptures, and let's say you demoted him from being a brother and you made him a neighbor. That's an honest demotion. He's no longer my brother, he's my neighbor. Then what should be your response to your neighbor? Well, Jesus says in Matthew 22 that we're to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. I said, so if you're a brother, your response should be to love him. If you are a neighbor, your response should be to love him. But what if you demoted him again? What if you demoted him from a brother to a neighbor and now you demote him to an enemy? You don't like him. You don't want to be around him. He is now your enemy. The question is, what is our response to our enemy? In Matthew 5, Jesus says that we're to love our enemies. You see, what the tension is that we're all brothers when we believe in Jesus. There is no room for disrespect. There is no room for a lack of love. There is no room for trust that doesn't exist when we follow Jesus. And so my brother, he looked at me and he said, so what are you saying? I'm saying to you, brother, and this is what I said to him, you must be intentional about building relationship with your brother. What if all of our political leaders were intentional about building relationships on the other side? What if they said, how do we go and build a relationship and love our brother and love our sister? What if we were intentional about it? Can you imagine what's going to happen here? And so as much as we want to rebuild, if we can't build relationship, it's just not going to work. I don't care how many building projects we do, if we don't rebuild relationship, if we don't rebuild trust and love and respect, and I've only seen that happen in our political circles in the United States one time, and it was back in 1992 when President Bill Clinton a Democrat, met with the Speaker, a Republican, and they came to the conclusion that we will not speak negatively of one another in public. We will not turn our backs on one another, but we will commit to love one another. They built a relationship. And the last time in 1992 in U.S. history, we balanced the budget with the two of them. God does great things when we come together. That God is calling us, not only that we build relationships in the diaspora, but we build relationships with one another. So some of you might say, well, Rick, how does that fit me personally? What about the parent who hasn't seen their child in a long time? What if you said, hey, how do I rebuild a relationship? Or what about if you've gone through a divorce and you've not spoken to your ex? What about saying, how do I build a bridge? What about the neighbor that you don't really like? How do you begin to build relationships? What about your Gen G? How do you build the bridge? You know, I have children. I have 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. What's fortunate is my 1 girl can beat up all of her brothers, but I have 5 children. And I remember last year coming to the prayer breakfast. And when my brother Earl and I got back home, we saw the Gen Z's frustration. And Earl asked, Rick, what do you think the problem is? What Gen Z is dying, and I'm talking because I have Gen Zs. They're dying to be loved. They're dying for a seat at the table. They're dying to be respected. And I won't ever forget when my boys were growing up, because sometimes as parents, we want our children to stay children all of their lives. But that's not the case with Gen Zers. Gen Zers have grown up, they've gone to college. Some of our Gen Zers are smarter than we are. I have a daughter, she's a doctor. Whenever I need advice on my health, I don't go to a hospital, I call my daughter. Whenever I want to invest my money, I don't go in and go to a bank, I call my son Caleb. When I need counseling and when I need therapy, no, I don't go to a psychologist, I go to my son Micah. Because all of my children have grown up. And they're no longer children. They're adults. And I had to learn to treat them like adults. And so when they graduated from college, I took each of them out to dinner. And I gave them a kiss. And I said, you are now an adult. I expect you to make decisions like an adult. I don't have to go and live anywhere in your neighborhood. None of my kids live within 1,000 miles of where I live. But they all act like adults. And one of the most frustrating things that could happen to a Gen Zer is that you keep treating them like a child. And I got to tell you, I started praying for Kenya. Because, I work with young people. I mentor young people. I understand a little bit about their minds. And one of the things I prayed for is I said, here's my prayer. I said, Lord, I pray the adults would apologize to our Gen Zers. I pray, see, it's like African Americans. We live in America, but a lot of times we don't feel respected. And people ask, why is there always a race issue in America? Yeah, I can tell you why. Because no one's ever apologized. No one's ever said, I'm sorry for the horrific pain that you experienced. They've never done it in our history in this country. And I just want to suggest to you, when we're talking about relationships and we're talking about really rebuilding relationships, wouldn't it be beautiful if leaders would stand up and say to our Gen Zs, we had you arrested. And we know that had to be traumatizing. And we're sorry. We shut down the internet. And we know that that's your primary source of communication. And we're sorry. Now we want to bring you to the table so that you can have a voice, because you're no longer a child. You're an adult. And we want to begin to say, how do we begin to treat you like an adult? I won't ever forget the time, and I'm almost done. I won't ever forget the time when a guy gave me permission to be an adult. I was in the NFL, my first year in the NFL. We had a coach he was a German guy by the name of Marty Schottenheimer. And when I got to Cleveland, I would go in, and when I would see the head coach, Marty Schottenheimer, I would say, "Hey, how are you doing, Coach Schottenheimer?" And he looked back at me and he said, "I'm doing fine. How are you doing, Player Bolden?" And the next day I would see him and I said, "Well, Coach Schottenheimer," and he would say, "Okay, Player Bolden." And after about a week, I went to him and I said, "Why do you keep calling me Player Bolden?" He said, "Rickey, you're an adult now. You don't have to call me Mr. Schottenheimer. You don't have to call me Coach Schottenheimer. You can refer to me as Marty. That's my name. You are a man now. I expect you to act like a man." And that's what our Gen Zers are crying for. They're crying for the right to be adults, because they are. They've gone to college. They're buying their own house. They're getting married. They're adults. And I want to encourage you even here today, Kenya. I challenge you that when we start talking about rebuilding relationships, then the question is, how do we begin to rebuild the relationships with our Gen Zers? Because they love you, they care for you, they respect you, but they don't feel respected. The last thing, and I'm leaving now, but you know, there was one other thing as I'm leaving, and I don't want to get out of here. The last relationship that I think you need to build, not only with Africans in the diaspora, not only Africans within your own country, but as I was leaving, I said, you must also build relationships, really rebuild your relationship with the Lord. That is serious. Did you hear what this wonderful man, Nehemiah, said? Listen to what he said here. And I'm on my way out of here. You know, my time is up. Yep, my time is up. Let me tell you what he said here. This was so critical. He says, "I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me." Did you see that? When I read that, it blew my mind. Let me tell you how I interpreted that. As I take my seat, whenever people do that, they're really not getting ready to, yes, I am going to take my seat. But listen to what Nehemiah was saying. He said, "I spoke to the king, but the King of Kings had his hand on me." Oh, that's different. Because while he honored and respected the king, as you go forth, Kenya, there's a King of Kings. And what we desire more than anything is that the King of Kings places his hand on our lives. And when you have the hand of the King of Kings on your lives will be blessed. And Kenya will never be the same. God bless you. God keep you.
You listen to Dr. Rickey Bolden.